next speaker today, Dr. Kristen Brennan, who will be talking about Ren Xiong self-portrait in the 19th century. So this is our most recent, I think our fourth now of the Commons conversations that we've been doing since the beginning of 2021. And so she'll be talking with us like previous ones about different strategies to help us incorporate this painting potentially into our survey classes. So Dr. Kristen Brennan is an associate professor at Pepperdine University, where she teaches courses on Asian art, as well as a survey of world art. And she has published extensively on Chinese art, including a very recent book on the artist Yan. And so she will be helping us out today. As I mentioned, I'm sure there will be questions. So just a reminder again to put them in the Q&A. And when Kristen is done talking, I will be fielding questions. But for now, let's turn it over to her. So Kristen, you can unmute yourself and I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Let's see. Let's switch over. Are we sharing? Let's take a look. And there we go. All right. Lauren, could you confirm that you're seeing my screen all right?
I am seeing your screen, thanks.
Good, super. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming. It's so nice to have this opportunity to speak about a painting which many of us may not have seen before, but it is one of my favorite paintings to use in my courses. I teach with this painting in my World Art History Survey course, so a very lower division course. But I've also used it in my upper division courses, of course, Chinese art, but also methods classes and other specialized courses. So I find it's a very scalable painting, one that brings forth a lot of really sort of engaging questions. And to begin, I think you might sort of think about entering, sort of wading into the waters of Chinese painting with this work, perhaps by mentioning something that maybe your students are familiar with. If they've studied anything of 19th century art, they would be familiar with Charles Baudelaire, who talks about the painter, of course, in his Painter of Modern Life, he talks about the artist as the man, a man of the world. And I think that this construct, as you know, which of course his world was 19th century Paris, but here we can think about this question of modernity in a more global sense. And I think this painting's a really fun way of sort of entering into that discussion. Ren Xiong's painting, I think, is overall very useful for seeing the artist at the center of his world. And his world, of course, was 19th century Shanghai, a very momentous, tumultuous world that was swirling around him. Looking at this painting, I think that there are a few different principles that we can peel out of it. And I'll speak about it in a few different steps. First, from the sort of more introductory principles of Chinese painting, for example, brushwork, calligraphic line, medium, format. Of course, self-portraiture is the sort of most obvious of those topics that we might sort of wade into as well, specifically how it relates to artistic status and identity, the idea of self-presentation and the cultural conventions behind that. This brings us then into the topic of portraiture overall, the sort of larger umbrella of portraiture. We'll speak about this quite a bit. The memorializing functions of portraiture and how they have specific uses in China and Chinese history as well. And for upper division courses, you might explore more deeply the idea of modernity and this idea of the momentous changes that were happening in Chinese history at this time. The opening of Shanghai as a treaty port, the Opium Wars, things like this we'll mention in a moment. And then finally, canon and this idea of how we position works and how we talk about the canon of Chinese art history, specifically this use of terminology like the Shanghai School, which Ren Xiong is often sort of described as a part of. So let's start with principles. I always start, of course, with asking students what they see, to describe what they see, starting with the lines. And that's, of course, important because Chinese art is often described as an art of the line, calligraphy, of course, being the backbone of painting. So when students start talking about lines, they immediately think or sort of jump on this idea of, gosh, those robes, it looks like he's painted them with a Sharpie. These sort of angular lines, almost sword-like. You can see that, that they seem to be sort of these kind of piercing, big sort of voluptuous contour lines, angular. And they contrast with his face, with this sort of soft modeling, the lightness around his eyes, his shoulder, the figure. And you can see even sort of the depressions of the bones on his chest. Two totally different kind of modes of brushwork here at hand. Of course, also you might notice color. Your students might notice that it's sort of a bluish grayish tone, this very cool, sort of stark tone. And again, color taking sort of a back seat to line. And that, of course, is very important. And of course, don't let your students get away without mentioning that the lines are also in the inscription, and that is an integral part of any Chinese painting. And of course, something that helps us understand even more the sort of messages we can glean from Ren Xiong and his world in this case. Now, in terms of the subject, of course, students are immediately sort of struck by the fact that we've got this penetrating gaze. He's looking directly right out at you, this frontal pose. And it seems that his hands, the subject's hands are positioned sort of one on top of the other. And it looks almost like he's resting them on a sword. And in fact, there are some lines, some very sort of vertical, sort of thick, bold lines that descend from his hands. And of course, give us this impression that he's just about ready to fight. He's got his robe sort of slipping off the side of his shoulder. It seems that there's this physicality about it. And of course, we might also discuss proportions and in fact, distortions. This idea that we've got these huge robes, giant feet, big pants, and this sort of small frame of the figure. And in fact, you know, the sort of bare torso and bare head, the fact that he's sort of got this sort of just very sort of subtle hint of hair on top of his head. All of this giving this sense of contrast, the very dramatic contrasts between the lines, the proportions, and the complete lack of any background, completely white behind him. Now, all of that, the ink and paper, of course, the ink and color, this is the sort of the materials, the methods behind Chinese painting, but also the thing that we don't want to miss is the importance of discussing format. Hanging scroll in particular, in this case, hanging scrolls and hand scrolls are two of the main formats that we see in Chinese art. And the hanging scroll in particular is especially public in its nature. Hanging scrolls like this, and this one, as you'll notice from its dimensions, is quite large. It's over 5 feet tall. So if this is hanging on a wall, it has sort of command of the whole room. This is a very sort of impressive and evocative work, as opposed to a hand scroll, which would have been viewed probably on a table by a limited number of people. You know, this sort of use, this choice that Ren Xiong made in making this a hanging scroll really gives us a larger than life sense of who he is, which brings us to our next point, self-portraiture. Artists, of course, can use self-portraits to assert status, how they'd like to be perceived. They're not especially marketable. Most people don't want a picture of an artist on their wall. So they're oftentimes thought of as something that's used by the artist for the artist, maybe something that he'd like to share with his friends. And leading into that concept, and we'll discuss identity and audience a little bit more here, you might start the discussion by asking students, what are some of the things that go through your head when you are taking a selfie? What are some of the things you think about? How do you present yourself? Why would you choose that background or this display or that filter or any of these kinds of details? And that leads us into conventions, right? What are the conventions for self-portraiture at this particular time in history? Now, to think about that, here's a comparison that you might make in your class. Chen Hongshou is an artist from 200 years earlier. We're talking 17th century Ming Dynasty. Both of these artists are picturing themselves in this sort of frontal facing, piercing gaze, sort of confident stance. They're sort of presenting themselves, looking out at the viewer. Now, the difference is, of course, are that Ren Xiong has done away with the landscape completely. We don't have any landscape whatsoever, no conventional iconographic sort of or accompanying attributes to characterize his place or his his sort of role in society that way. Chen Hongshou, on the other hand, was also a professional artist like Ren Xiong, and sort of using these kinds of conventions of his time. So in particular, we see this interest in the very stylized landscape. He's using some rocks and some trees in this sort of immortal, scholarly kind of world that he's positioning himself within. So Ren Xiong here is building on this concept of artistic status and identity in his own time, and using painting to make a very powerful statement about his own personal crisis, as we'll see, and that of the world around him. And in that way, we can talk about the artist as somebody who embodies this experience of their moment in time, and also to perhaps create something to be remembered by. And that's important, this idea of memory. Let's pause on that idea of memory for a moment to talk about portraiture. Here, I think it's really helpful to sort of broaden the scope, to flag to your students that self-portraiture is sort of one sort of subset of this larger category of portraiture. We may think about portraiture in China with these words that I've listed here, some of the functions that we might use to describe portraiture in China, some words like commemorating, memorializing, and very specifically also venerating, which is very important in Chinese portraiture throughout history. So to introduce that concept, we can maybe sort of think about this in common terms. You can ask students questions like, how do we remember the dead in our culture, or in your family even? What kinds of pictures do we choose to set out at a funeral, for example, or what do we read about in the news or in obituaries? Here we can see a few men that were remembered for the things that they accomplished. You can see how they've been sort of pictured as how they became celebrities, and how, of course, they're not being pictured on the day of their death. They're at their oldest age, and in their weakness, they're pictured at their sort of most vivacious times, their younger days, and the things that made them celebrities in the first place. It's a little bit different than what we have in the history of Chinese portraiture and the conventions behind it. So what kinds of cultural ideals and functions underlie portraiture in China? Now, in my classes, students will have already seen this painting that I'm showing you now, or other portraits like it. This one is of the Ming Dynasty Emperor Hongzhi. And you can see that this is a painting that is meant for sort of impressing us, first of all, with his imperial status, but also is made for veneration. It's something that was used for ancestral worship. It would have been hung over an ancestral altar. It would have been, his descendants would have come and looked at it, sort of placed objects out on the altar in a commemorative hall after his death. This is something to be remembered by. So this kind of portrayal, of course, gives rise to certain conventions in painting. We see the careful depiction of his face, right? The very realistic sort of kind of attention to his beard and very careful fine line details, in contrast to the very schematized body that's full of all kinds of iconographic attributes that suggest his powerful status and position as the emperor. It also seems very flat. It doesn't seem like a very naturalistic body. And that's important. That contrast between the face and the body gives us this otherworldly sense of the emperor. We know that he's not alive anymore. That's not how he looks anymore. It's not a snapshot of today. It's something that is meant to show that he's moved on to this very revered position of ancestorhood. His very high status. That is the most revered, sort of this old age is something to look forward to, actually, in this case. It's a cause for reverence. And the paintings, of course, sort of capture that. Now, similarly, going back to Ren Xiong, he's drawing on some of these portraiture conventions as well. Accuracy in the face, right? The schematized body that seems to be in sort of a sharp contrast. with the sort of details that we see in his sort of the fine line brushwork and the very sketchy nature of his body. That's interesting too here, because Ren Xiong painted this entire painting himself. Normally in the imperial context, there would be a portrait painter who did a face, and then there would be, you know, somebody who just specialized in making bodies, and they would sort of workshop the whole painting, like the imperial portrait we just saw. Here, Ren Xiong, as a professional artist, is able to do all of those things in one painting. And so this is also showing his skill as an artist. He's kind of conveying that to the viewer. He's able to do all of these things. He's very sort of shaded kind of details on his face, and the sort of very expressive forms and lines on his body. Also, some scholars have pointed out that perhaps there is some relationship to photography, the careful modeling we see in his face. Certainly, he would have been aware of these technological innovations at that time as well. Also, it's this attention to the face is rooted in Chinese concerns for facial physiognomy. That's something that the face is something that's incredibly important, not just for veneration, but just for assessing who an individual is, where they're sort of how their faces are shaped is something that's thought to provide some insights into who they are as a person. Now, Ren Xiong may have painted his portrait not necessarily to be represented in real time, but perhaps as he might want to be remembered in death, given these sort of conventions that he's drawing on here. In fact, death was not very far off, unfortunately, for Ren Xiong. He actually died in his mid-30s of tuberculosis. He had already gone to battle in civil war that we'll discuss in just a moment, but he was undoubtedly aware in his time that death could come at any moment. And I think that was very present, this idea of this painting standing as much as a statement in his life as it is for perhaps its use in his death. Which brings us to the next, our fourth point of modernity. And talking about this kind of concept of what was going on in China, which was a lot in the 19th century. Ren Xiong painted his portrait before the fall of China's last imperial dynasty. His portrait, as we've discussed, is very breathtaking, bold. It suggests that he saw himself as living really in the eye of the storm, sort of as a very sort of self-aware, very modern stance, his kind of awareness in his particular moment. He also pictures himself as somewhat tormented, this representation that fits with what we know about his life and this sort of tragic period in which he was living. And many of the clues that we have from this come from the historical circumstances, which I'll discuss in a minute: civil war, the rise of Shanghai as an international city, and of course the fall of the Qing dynasty. Here we see the first few words that Ren Xiong uses on his inscription. And so we'll turn to the inscription now as something that helps us to understand a little bit more about what he's trying to convey. Now, his inscription is sort of the key to understanding this self-image as one of disillusionment. It's written in a very candid tone, and it uses a meter that was used in popular plays at that time. And it begins, as you see here, with "The world in turmoil, what lies ahead of me?" And he goes on to point out that artists so frequently talk about the paragons of history, the very famous figures that have shaped, sort of the celebrities of the past. But there's not very much mention, as he notes, of the common man, the ordinary people. And at the same time, we know that he was fascinated with the subject. He was making woodblock prints at the time of ancient heroes and relating to this idea of lowly status, just as he was also going out to fight in many of these the civil war that was going on at the time. I'll discuss in a moment. But in any case, the inscription plus his portrayal of himself in this image seems to be arguing for these kinds of unsung heroes, very much that in almost an arrogant way, also saying that he is one of them himself. Which brings us to what is going on at his time that has brought him to this tormented state. Ren Xiong, we know, fought with imperial troops in a civil war known as the Taiping Rebellion. And this was a rebellion that followed other historical circumstances, the opening of Shanghai most significantly as a treaty port in 1842, which was following the Opium Wars, a foreign crisis that it was between, of course, China and the British over opium smuggling. And Shanghai was opened as a result of that. Now, the Taiping Rebellion was an uprising of Chinese peasants that nearly toppled the dynasty, and it sort of uprooted the ways of life for people that were living in the areas around Shanghai and through the southwest and into the south, actually. And the dynasty was really failing to suppress this rebellion. And so a lot of the scholar gentry, the figures that lived in these areas, had to form their own armies and enlist people like Ren Xiong to come defend their land and their families and their cultures. And of course, many people were killed during this time. The estimates are that over 30 million people died in this rebellion, and many people were displaced. And those people who were refugees, many of those came into Shanghai. They fled to Shanghai and the population swelled. So Shanghai became, sort of this place for refugees, just at the same time that we've got the American, the French, and the British all moving in and building concessions around the city and engaging in all different kinds of activities. So a period of momentous change, right? Just complete turmoil. All of this, of course, brings us to our fifth and final point, which is of Ren Xiong, who your students may have been introduced to in a textbook talking about Shanghai School artists. And Shanghai School artists as artists that, it raises this question of not just in Shanghai, but more broadly, this question of schools and lineages and how we talk about Chinese art. If your students have been reading any textbook, they would have been introduced to this notion of schools. And that's something that can be very problematic, actually, as a way of describing the connections between artists, because they weren't necessarily all related as family members. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were in the same city. Sometimes they didn't even know each other. It's a wide variety of ways that these artists have been connected, and not necessarily even through style. It is sort of a kind of a methodological concern that I can kind of mention, what does this even mean? Ren Xiong, for example, actually probably didn't even paint this work in Shanghai, more likely in his hometown of Zhejiang province, which is sort of the next province over. So what does it mean then to use this term Shanghai School? This term typically, again, refers to artists that were loosely based in and around Shanghai. It was a derogatory term that was applied at that time to sort of talk about the art market, the theater, the entertainment, the kind of the culture in Shanghai at that time. And it was also sort of referring to some artists who, were connected to one another loosely. They were very much at the center of the kinds of social changes that we see in Shanghai at this time. Their works often catered to city dwellers in this sort of newly opened commercial port city, but there is no singular style that we can use to define them. Some of them worked in very meticulous, detailed and sort of elegant styles, and others in very spontaneous and expressive, bold manners. Really a wide variety of styles and of subjects too. The subjects oftentimes being sort of veering more towards the popular, a little bit less aloof than we might have seen in scholarly paintings from the past. This interest in mundane and everyday subjects also seems to be something that falls under the definitions of the Shanghai School. So those are important things to kind of just discuss and bring awareness to even at the foundational level for students as they sort of head into questions about the canon more broadly. So to start wrapping this up, we can start thinking about Ren Xiong as somebody who was associated with other artists in Shanghai, but he appears to have really painted his self-portrait as a very provocative image, one that invites questions, one that asks the viewer to confront who he is as an artist and as a member of society. He's picturing himself, of course, as we've talked about, this frontal gaze, this forceful brushwork, and with a self-awareness that sort of he displays as an artist in this very tumultuous period in history. So to review, going from this sort of more introductory through the more advanced kind of concepts, we can talk about Ren Xiong's, sort of painting as something that embodies these principles of Chinese painting, the use of ink and color, art of the line, calligraphy, the importance of medium and format. We've talked about self-portraiture as something that sort of stimulates this idea of self-presentation, artistic identity, and status of the artist in a particular time. And of course, portraiture conventions that are specific to China, right? Especially this idea of memorializing and venerating how some of these works might have functioned, which leads us into the question of death and of modernity and of everything that was going on in 19th century Shanghai. And of course, then what does it mean to say a Shanghai School artist in the canon? So thinking about all of this, so what I find so interesting is that Ren Xiong was very much removed, was not necessarily removed from society. He's very much immersed in these kinds of things that were happening around him. He conceived himself as sort of an ordinary man, somebody who, very much was shaping history himself as a civilian fighter and as a professional artist. There was all of this wrapped together in this portrayal. And I think you can, again, loop back to this idea of what it means to be a man of the world in 19th century Shanghai. So with that, I will conclude my talk and thank you for listening to all of these ideas. I look forward to your questions.
Let's see, Ken, one sec. Thank you so much, Kristen. That was really wonderful. Let me pull up the Q&A here. It looks like we have a question about style. So it says, would you say the style that Xiong uses here was common in Chinese art at this time, or was it more unique specifically to him? And maybe what was the kind of long-lasting influence that it had on art, if any?
That's a great question. What he is doing, I think, which is so sort of unique at this time, is pulling together a couple of different styles, right? And specifically when we talk about styles too, keeping that idea of brushwork at the center of it is really important. He's using this sort of meticulous, fine-lined sort of style to characterize the face. That's really important because it kind of addresses what we see oftentimes as associated with court painting and more, sort of this idea of representing sort of accuracy. But then on the other hand, we have this very expressive brushwork, right? And that is something that's typically associated with a totally different kind of history of painting, of this idea of the literati, who were scholar amateurs, people that painted for fun and to convey their ideas and to give you this sort of bold kind of feeling through their lines. So I think that idea of him pulling on both of these is something that's very unique and he really sort of punches it up a level. Other artists had done this before him, but not really bringing it all together in such a way that seems also very deeply personal. And that seems to be specifically 19th century sort of Shanghai kind of approach. He really is kind of pushing the envelope in terms of style, I guess, in that regard. I wouldn't have one particular way, but sort of bringing those veins together is what he's doing, I think.
So that's really compelling, actually, to know that he's doing that. Well, we have time for a couple more questions, and we have another one that is about what would have motivated him to portray himself in this plain yet intricate style?
Right. Great question, too. I'm wondering too if he wasn't, my sneaking suspicion and kind of where I'm going with the portraiture angle is that I'm thinking that he may have also been leaving this for the future, leaving a representation of himself. Remember, he's only in his 30s. Usually artists didn't get this good until they were like in their 60s. So this idea that, he's not this old guy that is looking back on his life. He really thinks that his life is going to be short. He's been on the battlefield. He has been in and out of all these cities. He's seen people dying. I think that this is a very traumatized person probably at this time. He's probably dealing with a lot right in front of his face that other artists really probably never saw. And that's specific to this particular time in history. And I think probably that idea of maybe what he's thinking is maybe I'll thinking through who he is and how he might want to be remembered.
I think that angle that you mentioned, that idea of thinking about trauma too, is probably one that resonates probably a lot with students right now. Yeah. So that's a really good suggestion in terms of thinking about that. Yeah. So maybe a final question here is about the volume of the body, and someone who's wondering whether or not that volume is of a Western influence.
That's a great question. I would think, actually, the funny thing is that when I've heard other scholars kind of talk about this, they always focus on the Western influence side of the top part of his, like his sort of facial features, right? But this idea of capturing the bones, the flesh, the sort of softness of his body, it could be either related to photography, this idea of kind of realistically capturing that. That's something that some scholars have talked about, actually, in relation to this painting in particular. And no doubt he has been, for actually, at this point, from the 18th century, we had very realistic depictions of human figures in China, very much as part of the art scene. So it wouldn't have been new in terms of Western influence, but absolutely that was there. It was something that every artist that was working at this time would have seen, not just because of photography, but painting and history, and even within China. The fact that we had Jesuits working at the court in the imperial workshops since the 18th century, these kinds of Western influences were absolutely present. Whether or not he himself directly intersected with them is a different question, but it was part of his world, for sure.
I was thinking, and then that also presents another interesting pathway for people to think about bringing this into their classrooms, right? Thinking about that. I think we have one more quick question, if that's okay.
Sure.
And it's about, could you tell us maybe the direction that his audience would have read the characters?
Oh, great. Yes, great question. It's always right to left. So that part that's just right above, the closest part to his face, would have moved out from there. So it goes from right to left, so backwards of what we read in English, and it goes down. So you start at that upper right corner and sort of read down in lines towards the left, and it's getting longer and longer. And then one way to always tell is that if there are any of those red seals, that is usually, in this case, since it's his own inscription, that's likely his own seal, but sometimes you'll see collector's seals after the inscription. So it sort of punctuates the end. It's not a period. We don't have any punctuation in here whatsoever, but the red seal is a dead giveaway that that's the end. So
that's actually really useful. Useful to know. So we just had one more question come in, and then I think what I'll suggest everyone, if you have more questions for Kristen, we can bring them to the Facebook group, the Smart History Commons. But the last question is about, whether you would address in a more advanced course the presence of this portrait in the Palace Museum in Beijing compared to, say, the scroll you showed earlier that's part of the National Palace Museum in Taipei, and like the different nature of these collections.
Oh, right. So absolutely. In an upper division course, 100%, we're talking about how collections are divided and where they've all ended up, where things have. And of course, upper division students would have hopefully probably learned that much of the imperial collection from Beijing, in other words, the Qing Dynasty collection and everything before it that they had collected, was shipped and is in Taiwan. So that National Palace Museum collection, that's where most of the imperial artworks are. This work, on the other hand, was nothing to do with imperial, right? This is something that was in Shanghai in a different sort of circulation, and likely was later moved into Beijing, into the collection there on the Palace Museum in Beijing, which still, it does, it's also a very robust and, sort of outstanding collection, but it suggests also in this case, the lack of a connection with the court. So I'm dealing with those two different, and even actually the fact that much of the Qing collection moved into Taiwan around this period too is also very important. A lot of things were shuffling and moving, including the art collections. So that's a great
Sounds like
question.
The 19th century is a very exciting century to teach and globally. So, well, thank you so much for joining us. This was really wonderful. And, like I said, if people have questions for Kristen, feel free to bring them to the Facebook Commons and we can continue that conversation. And otherwise, we'll say goodbye for now.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren. It was really fun.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.